So our next speaker is Alf Håkon Hoel. He is the Counselor for Fisheries and Oceans at the Royal Norwegian Embassy in Washington, D.C., and also the Regional Director of the Institute of Marine Research. He was involved in many panels and groups that deal with how to translate necessities into policies. So as we are looking in this panel here for how can we actually translate what we know, what we have to do into real action, we hope that he can tell us, A, what can be done, and B, what is on the horizon that we can look forward to.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to tell you what I hope is a good story, a positive story, about how the collaboration between the science community and the policy community can bring about the positive things in the Arctic. Yeah, thank you. And this photograph demonstrates very well, I think, the perception a number of people have of the looming dangers for the Arctic marine ecosystems, be it petroleum exploration, shipping, or the exploitation of living marine resources. I'm going to talk about living marine resources, fishing. In the middle of the Central Arctic Ocean, there is a loophole, an area beyond national jurisdiction, international waters. Most of those are ice-covered year-round. However, in the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment about 15 years ago, we predicted that with declining ice, we may see a future where living marine resources move further north into the Central Arctic Ocean. And we see this happening now on the European side. Now, where is that pointed? This part of the Arctic, fisheries already take place at about 80 degrees north. Those fisheries are well regulated. They take place within the waters of the coastal states. On the other side of the Arctic, to the north of the Bering Sea and the Saxby Sea and the Beaufort Sea, there are no fisheries for now. But scientists think that eventually fish stocks may move into the Central Arctic Ocean, and we have areas here beyond national jurisdiction in international waters that are already ice-free in the summertime. So there is a concern that it is necessary to address this situation in a precautionary manner. And no, doesn't work. About 2008, informal conversation started among the 5 coastal states around the Arctic Ocean about what to do about this. And in 2010, the first formal meeting was called by the government of Norway in what could be called a ping-pong process between the scientific community and the 5 governments. I think it is important to say that this process was basically led by the U.S. It's led and driven by the U.S. government.
You just have to tell them when you want to.
Yeah. And this is basically what happened the first 5 years. This initial meeting in Oslo asked a question to the scientists, what do we know? And the scientists got together the year after and said, well, not much. And we need to establish baseline data. And then the governments met again and posed a much more precise question. are there prospects for commercial fisheries to take place in this donut hole in the middle of the Central Arctic Ocean? And then we met again, the scientists, and said, no, we don't think so. We don't think so. Not in the near future, maybe in some distant future, but we need to know more. And then the governments met again in Nuuk in February 2015 and basically agreed to an agreement to prevent unregulated fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean. These are the guys who completed that agreement among the 5 coastal states. And the agreement basically say that the 5 states will not let their vessels engage in fishing in this area in the Central Arctic Ocean, will establish a program of scientific research and monitoring, and beyond that, initiate another process with the involvement of more countries. Because the high seas area is open to anyone. Anyone can go fishing there. So it was important to bring on board those countries who might, at some point in the future, start fishing in that area. So for the last couple of years, we've been negotiating the 5 coastal states on the one hand, and then China, Korea, Japan, Iceland, and the EU. And there have been 5 meetings since December 2015, and we're aiming for a legally binding agreement, basically containing the same elements as the 2015 agreement, to abstain from unregulated fishing, set up a scientific program, and also some other elements about decision making and so on, which I will not comment upon now. The next steps from where we are right now is building on what we have already done, to meet again in Ottawa in fall this year to develop an implementation plan which is about ship time, with scientific institutions is to do what, who is going to pay for what, who is going to sail where, in what times, and so on. It's very practical and concrete phase of the project now. The larger picture here is that when we arrive at an agreement, and we will arrive at an agreement, that this will be the first pan-Arctic treaty with non-Arctic countries participating in the agreement. That's an important thing. And second, it's an important building block in the future institutional architecture of the Arctic Ocean. As has been mentioned before, we have had a search and rescue agreement, we've had an oil spill agreement, we had the IMO Polar Code, and a number of other things. Now we also have another element relating to living marine resources, which is important. And in the near future, the coming few years, the scientific work is likely to be the key element and the most important part of this work. And let me conclude by showing you a photograph of the new Norwegian ice-breaking research vessel. It will start sailing later this year, and it will open up a totally new area of marine research in the Arctic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob, for this tour de force. So I would like to ask the other two speakers to join Bob on the podium, or on the stage, actually. As you might have noted by now, we, as organizers, fell victim to the illusion that you can hold a scientist to 10 minutes. So everything will slide back a little bit. But let's see when Vera is up. So the floor is now open for questions for all three of the panelists. And as Olaf already mentioned, no, Ed mentioned in his introductory remarks, please be concise in your questions and also in the answers. Okay, here in the middle. Yes, please. Yeah. We will repeat the question if you just try. I don't think there is a mic moving around, or is there somebody who can? Okay. I would just start to speak and see if we can get that through. It's here in the middle.
I have a question for Vera. Is this on?
Yeah,
Yes.
it's on.
Inuit, the ICC is very concerned about Inuit and indigenous perspectives being included in policy and the decision making. And I just wanted to know if you could give me an example, and I'm thinking specifically of the hunters, how the hunters are affected in being able to make a living when they're not included, when that perspective is not included by the decision makers and policy makers.
I think it's all about politics right now. We're dealing with a lot of decisions are made in DC that will greatly impact us. Right now we're dealing with the ivory ban, which is trying to address the elephant ivory poaching. Our hunters are concerned about that because that ban includes walrus ivory, which is a big economic resource for our communities. That's how many of our artists and craftsmen make their living out of, is making beautiful arts and crafts. But ICC is also concerned about having our indigenous knowledge be recognized and included in many of the discussions. And I think I can give an example of how a hunter's knowledge of working with science helps. Is two of our hunters were involved in tagging walrus research in the vessel, and the vessel was stuck in ice and they couldn't find walrus, but our hunters said, well, let's stop the engines and listen to the sound. And the scientists turned off the engine, and the hunters said, well, if you listen, we will find the walrus in this fog. They traverse through the waters in this foggy condition, and they found the walrus, including use of smell, because walrus has a distinct odor when there's a lot of them out on ice. And I think those types of specialized knowledge will greatly enhance science work when two are combined. And I think that's where ICC is trying to advocate to make sure that indigenous knowledge is recognized and appreciated and included in any of the research activities, and would actually benefit us too.
Let's just take 2-3 more questions and then let them answer as a package, because otherwise I don't think we will get far. So I have one here. Yeah.
Yes, I think this is for Dr. Hoel mostly, but I think it's quite clear that our CO2 emissions are going up too much. But what can we do to reduce them? And does it matter on an individual level, or does it just need to change on a political legislation level? And in that, does it even matter what the US does as a whole, or is it really only what China does?
So just keep the question. Let's take 1 or 2 more. There was one over there.
Thank you for the talk. I have a question for Alf, which is you've explained to us the implications of fisheries development in the Central Arctic Ocean. I'm interested a bit more about how does that relate to oil and gas Russia's perspective in comparison to the rest of the circumpolar states? Because I've always had the impression that
You get that one.
the Russians have had this manifest destiny in the Arctic.
He wants to know the conflict between fishing and...
Okay, I think the question has been asked. There is one right here in the front.
So, my name is Svein Mathisen, and I'm working for the International Center for Reindeer Husbandry in Kautokeino in Norway. We are working in the circumpolar north, and this is a comment to Vera. Thank you for a very nice presentation today. But reindeer husbandry is maybe the best example. If you don't include traditional knowledge in the modern management, it goes to zero. One way or another. The economy is getting bad. You're not able to adapt to the climate change if you're not including traditional knowledge. That's the Norwegian story. That's how Norway used its oil money to make a modern management of reindeer husbandry, Sami reindeer husbandry. It didn't include the reindeer husbandry, and people are left in a very tricky situation. Okay, what's happened to Alaska? Maybe the largest research grants ever to reindeer and reindeer husbandry was given to the research university in Alaska. And nothing is left. There's no reindeer left. Because there was no focus on traditional knowledge in the science development. Traditional knowledge is going to and have to be an important part of the development of the communities in the circumpolar north. And we have to work together. The US, Norway, Alaska, Northern Norway, we have to work together and make a common program. Thank you.
Okay, so I think what we will do, or try to do, is pick up the questions as you see them relate to yourself, but as you are answering them, it would be good to also try and fold in some of your ideas about what kind of action do you envision will or should happen to address some of these issues that have been questioned here. So let's start with Bob, and then we move over here.
There are two themes I wanted to pick up on this. The first has to do with some things Wainwright and Vera raised. There's more than just bringing traditional knowledge to the table. One of the great philosophers of Norway, in my view, is Nil Askell, and he raises the following question. Let's assume that we do bring all those ideas to the table, but you know what? We always resolve the matter in a Western culture court or a Western culture philosophy. And if you look back, these folks have been living in these regions for, well, in northern Norway, probably 6,000 to 7,000 years. So there's a dilemma about how it is you negotiate a solution, even if you get it there. Second of all has to do with your question. We completed a pretty careful look at this issue of energy a couple of years ago, worldwide assessment. And step one, if we got really smart, we could reduce our emissions by 40% by more efficiently using our energy. That's a big deal. Secondly, Peter raised ways that we can begin to think about doing this transition. I can put it fairly simply. Right today, we as a global world put about $1.5 trillion every year into building new fossil fuel capacity. So we have the money. If we started moving that over, the picture I just showed you is solvable. So we have a decision to make, and so it's a decision to be made in the political, cultural, and quite frankly, socioeconomic communities that have to participate in these matters. Thank you.
Okay, Alf?
Let me pick up on the same issue, the question of traditional knowledge and how to engage traditional knowledge with modern Western scientific knowledge. My perception is that we have a very good development in that respect over the last years. For example, the agreement under negotiation I spoke about has specific provisions about that. The international agreement on scientific cooperation in the Arctic negotiated in the Arctic Council will be signed at the ministerial in May also contain language specifically about additional knowledge and how to work that together with scientific knowledge. So I think there is a positive development in that regard. When it comes to the question of how to sort of reconcile the concerns of different industries, be it petroleum, fisheries, shipping, those are essentially a question of competing uses and competition for space. And the broad answer to it is marine spatial planning. The thing I spoke about is sort of way beyond that. It's in the Central Arctic Ocean. It's a future thing. It's a non-existing problem in that area. But if you go to the subarctic, it's very much a question that is addressed every day in the Arctic countries. And in Norway, the broad answer to it has been marine spatial planning in the format of marine management plans, where you, for example, put certain limits to where petroleum activity can take place and when it can take place.
Okay, last word for Vera.
Well, I think we always try to encourage the researchers and scientists to coordinate, communicate, consult with our communities, which, especially on issues or projects that would have an impact on our people in our communities. So those are the recommendations that we always propose to outsiders.
So I would like to thank all three speakers and panelists, and then we will move on to the final segment.
Okay, thank you. Well, our last segment this afternoon is called Communicating Arctic Change, Innovative Approaches to Engagement. And I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Lawrence Hamilton. Larry's a Carsey Senior Fellow and Professor of Sociology at the University of New Hampshire. His work involves integrating data from social and natural sciences, such as in the Arctic, the human dimensions of climate change, and environmental sociology. And Larry has, over the years, done some really interesting survey work about people's attitudes towards such things as climate change, the Arctic, their knowledge about the Arctic. And so I'd like to invite him up here now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. If this sounds good, I'll start out by saying now for something completely different. I gave the title What People Know, and by that I'm referring not to what scientists know and not to what Arctic residents know, but what do people who are not in the Arctic, the general U.S. public, know. I'm a sociologist by training, and I'm going to show you some results from a recent U.S. general public survey, specifically about the Arctic. Okay, apparently it's not clicking, so can we do the next slide? Many drivers of Arctic change come from outside the Arctic. So what people outside the Arctic think or know or imagine about the Arctic matters to the Arctic residents. And there have been a small number, you could count them on one hand, of general public surveys in the U.S. that have tried to assess what the public knows or thinks about the Arctic. First one of those was in 2006, and the most recent one was just completed in December of last year. This most recent one, which I'll be summarizing for you today, involved a random sample of about 1,400 people, roughly 1,000 of those from the 49 U.S. states and another 400 oversampled from Alaska. So for the first time, we're trying to figure out what Alaskans know. Next. The a previous stage of the survey, just done immediately before the election in August of last year, the results have been published by the Carsey Institute, the Carsey School where I work, and anybody can download this if they'd like, or if you, really a lot of this stuff's been published. So if you see something go by too fast and you wish you had that information, write me a note and I can probably send you the files. Next, and that was called Where is the North Pole? And you'll see why. Some questions about the Arctic, and these questions are pretty carefully written. So one of them reads something like, in a telephone interview, which of the following statements do you think is most accurate? That the area of ice covering the Arctic Ocean in late summer is less now than it was 30 years ago. And of course, having seen Peter's or Bob's slides, you know exactly what the answer to that is. It's very much less. Or, another choice, is it more now than it was 30 years ago? Or, thirdly, did it decline and then recover to about the same level as 30 years ago? And most people get that right. You can see the top bar here. Let's see if I can point. Yeah, almost 70% understand that the area of sea ice covering the Arctic Ocean in late summer is less than it was 30 years ago. You notice that's an example of our careful wording. There's some earlier surveys that would say something like, are the ice caps melting? And it's very unspecific about which ice caps in what season and so forth. So I try to give, I don't think it makes much difference to the general public, but it does make difference if you're going to claim that there's a right or a wrong answer to a question. Next question. Here's a much harder question, though, and that's a clue. This is, again, this came up in both Peter's and Bob's talk. Which of the following would do the most to raise sea level if it happened? Melting the sea ice on the Arctic Ocean, melting land ice in Greenland, Antarctica, or melting glaciers in the Himalaya? And of course, the right answer is melting land ice in Greenland, Antarctica. That could contribute something over 200 feet if they both melted. But you can see only 40% of the people got that one, only 34% got that right. A larger fraction thought that it would be sea ice. Now, I'll say more about this in a minute, but here's the difference between the first question and the second. The first question, if you have some meme in your head about the Arctic ice is melting, that whispers in your ear what the right answer is. But knowing that Arctic ice is melting doesn't give you a clue what the right answer to this question is. You'd actually have to know some geography, and most people don't. Next item. Here's another trick question. This was the title for my paper. Where is the North Pole? Which of the following best describes the geography at the North Pole? Is it ice a few feet or yards thick covering a deep ocean? Is it ice more than a mile thick over land? Or is it a rocky mountainous landscape? And you can see that just a bit over 40% got that answer correct. And almost an equal number thought that it was ice over a mile thick over land. This despite the fact that every globe you've ever seen shows a big ocean up there in the Arctic, and probably back in 4th grade, most of us learned about the oceans and continents. Doesn't matter. And also notice that this is the same survey where 70% said that Arctic sea ice was melting. So they're not connecting these things. The knowledge is just a few feet or yards thick over a deep ocean, so to speak. Next slide. This is the hardest question I asked. We asked, which of the following countries has territory and thousands of people living north of the Arctic Circle? And the choices we gave them were the United States, which is the correct answer. There's a large fraction of Alaska north of the Arctic Circle. China, Estonia, I put that in, and I apologize for any Estonians in the audience, just because I am guessing most Americans have no clue where that is. Or Britain, and most people thought this was a trick question in which the answer was none of the above. So only 18% of our U.S. sample recognized that the U.S. has territory with thousands of people north of the Arctic Circle. Incidentally, you see at the bottom of all these slides, there's a DKNA that's don't know or give no answer. So people can say they don't know, but that's not a very popular choice. People would rather take a guess, or maybe they think they do know. Okay, next one. Now, it's not random. And I'll be the first to mention Donald Trump. He's the elephant in the room, and many people here have been thinking about him, probably quite a few cycles during the day. Most scientists will not raise that name because he's not in their data. He is in my data. He is absolutely unavoidable. Politics in general is the dominating division in survey data sets today. And to not tell you about that, I would be being deceptive, so I'm going to go there. The sea ice is less thing connects with people's beliefs about climate change. So there is about almost a 30-point gap between what Trump voters and all others. It turns out I can lump together the Clinton voters, the Sanders voters, the Jill Stein voters, the people who didn't vote. They're all not very different with regard to climate change. The Trump voters stand apart. So that's what I've done in this graph here. It's not Trump versus Clinton, it's Trump versus everybody else, including the people who didn't vote. And 77% of them think Arctic sea ice is less, only half the Trump voters do. And this is a basic physical observation, of course. Other questions, like the North Pole, where your convictions about global warming are not whispering in your ear, have much less of a political division. So there's really two kinds of knowledge. There's the kind that links to your ideology, to your personal beliefs, and that is going to follow the opinion leaders of your party and the news media that you trust and so forth. And there's another kind of knowledge, which is just basically, where is the North Pole? Your politics don't give you a clue, and people don't know that, and it's a much weaker political effect. So one of those reflects ignorance, the other reflects cultural cognition, the biased assimilation of information from different sources. For instance, the last one, territory. Who's got territory above the Arctic Circle? No political difference whatsoever, nor should there be. There's nothing in your politics that gives you the answer to that question. All right, next slide. Well, what about Alaskans? Are they any better with this stuff? Well, they are. All of these differences, the light bar is Alaska residents and the blue bar is other 49 states. In all of them, the Alaskans are better than lower 49 in accurately answering these Arctic questions. But it's not very impressive. At the top, we've got 83% of Alaskans compared with 69% otherwise know that sea ice is less. Well, that's pretty good. But only 63% of Alaskans know where the North Pole is. There's a little bit better guess among Alaskans about what would raise sea level. And rather astonishingly, only half of Alaskans know that the United States has territory and population above the Arctic Circle. And if you know Alaska, you understand why this is, because the population centers, all the McDonald's and everything else are well south of the Arctic Circle, and a lot of the people actually moved there from other parts of the U.S., and there's no particular reason why the great majority of Alaskans would ever travel into the Arctic. It doesn't connect by roads. It's just not part of their awareness. Okay, next slide. We asked some questions about what are important problems now that are caused by climate change. The leading candidate was weather effects. Sea level, which gets the most emphasis in a lot of scientific reports, people don't think of that as something that's problematic now. I mean, in certain places it is, but for the most part they see that as something that's farther out in the future, whereas weather, they're hearing that from their TV weather people. I think that's the opening wedge of public awareness that climate might be bad for you. When you start hearing that this unusual warm December or extra tornadoes or other things you might be experiencing might in some way be connected with climate change. So we get 60% there. We've done some earlier studies. It's not the same survey as this, but one we did earlier just in New Hampshire, where we discovered that the temperature on the day which we ran the survey affected your answer about whether the Arctic was changing your weather. And the pattern here is that unusually cold or warm days, people were more likely to say, yes, Arctic change is going to affect my weather. Okay, next slide. Who do you trust for information? This is a key question in a lot of this work. Where on earth do you get these ideas? And the first question was, it's more words to it than that. It's scientists such as NASA who study the climate. So it's, again, pretty specific. And scientists will be encouraged to see that 72% said, yes, we trust scientists such as NASA who study the climate for information about climate change. Friends, we didn't really expect that. Friends and family is a big one. And this, I think, goes to the sort of multiplication effect of, that in everybody's group of family or friends, there are a few know-it-alls who will tell you their opinions and the facts they just learned about climate change. And reaching those people has a magnifying effect on other people around the Thanksgiving table. So it's an interesting, a slightly different perspective than what I came into this with. Websites are, and this was worried, websites you follow, not just any old website. And likewise, religious leaders of your faith or political leaders of your party. And finally, Fox News. That's something I put in because I knew what would happen with it. So Fox News is trusted least and scientists the most. Next slide. High priority, and I guess I didn't include the political breakdown, but it's exactly what you would expect, that Fox News, the very most conservative people consider Fox News the second most reliable source of information immediately after scientists for information about climate change. And nobody else thinks that. What actions, this goes to a question that was asked of the previous panel, what actions do you think should have a high priority to reduce the risk of climate change? Well, people like renewable energy. That's a very popular answer. Behavioral and consumer changes to reduce energy consumption, fairly popular too. Cap and trade, and we have a little sentence explaining what this is, not so popular. And carbon tax, and we specified a revenue-neutral carbon tax in which revenue is returned to consumers. Even so, nobody likes that. Next slide. And here's how it breaks down politically. And what you see, each of those is a Democrats, independents, non-Tea Party Republicans, Tea Party Republicans split. And it's the same gradient on every one of them. The levels are different, but the gradient is very similar. And this is why I say it's in my data. I can't not talk about it. It shows up on almost anything I analyze. And you can see that a good takeaway, to say something positive for a change, is that Democrats and independents, all by both large majorities in both cases, favor renewable energy and lifestyle changes. Democrats, independents, and even non-Tea Party Republicans, we have half or more favoring renewable energy development. So that's as close as there comes to an apple pie issue. But the hardcore conservatives are having none of any of these. And again, that's fairly typical. Okay, I think that's my last slide. We'll go to the next one. And the next one, I think, is just a list of references. Next slide. Yes, which is too long for you to copy down, but just to make the point that if you're curious about this stuff, there's a lot written down and a lot I can share with you if anybody wants to send me an email. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Larry. I'd like to introduce our next speaker now, Dr. Stephanie Furman. Stephanie's the Hirshhorn Professor of Environmental Science at Barnard College and Director of the Polar Learning and Responding Climate Change Education Partnership. Stephanie's scientific research focuses on the Arctic environment and particularly on the nature and dynamics of Arctic sea ice under changing climate. Her previous research activities have included melting and surging glaciers and pollution transportation by sea ice.
Thank you, Mary Beth. And so continuing on the communication about what are our communication strategies and what are our communication priorities. You see here on the left what Arctic sea ice has typically been like at the end of summer, our summer minimum after you've had the melting throughout the entire summer. On the right is where we'll be in 15 to 30 years. So it's a dramatic change. And what does this mean? How can we communicate this? What are the most important elements? Next slide. So I'm the lead on this Polar Learning and Responding Climate Change Education Partnership. Several of the people who are here today, Peter, Mary Beth, and Larry, are all members of this partnership, along with several other groups, including Hurtigruten Cruise Lines, which we had seen a slide from earlier. What we're doing is we're gathering together to create novel educational approaches to reach adults, including teachers, and through teachers we can reach students about the changing Arctic and what we can do to respond. And I'll show you some of these novel educational approaches that we'll actually have showcased, so you can actually try them out yourself during the reception following this event. Next slide. So what is it that we want to communicate? You know, what are our communication goals? And Peter mentioned this 5-degree Arctic and a 2-degree world, and that basically breaks down into two sides. One is adaptation. You know, how can we adapt to the changing Arctic? What changes are we anticipating, and what can we do to respond? And then the other part of it is how can we mitigate the changes? What can we do in terms of alternative energy, lifestyle changes? So the next slide. I'll show you what we're going to be, so first of all, we want to know what we want to communicate, and the second part is who do we want to communicate them to. So one of the interesting groups are people who have changed their minds on climate change, and to see what is it that actually got them to change their mind. Because if we could do more of that, we would be in a very different place. So there was this sort of informal poll on Reddit, which generally is for sort of a younger audience than at least me and many of you as well. What they did was they asked people who changed their mind on climate change, what was it that made them change their mind, got them to change their mind? So it was nice to see science showed up there. So people were exposed to science, sometimes in a class, sometimes in a video or something that they saw, maybe in an event like this, and it woke them up and they said, there's something changing here, there's something that I need to pay attention to, and it kind of shifted their mindset. 29% of them said it's stewardship and care for the earth. So they thought about the long-term future. What is their legacy? What is the world that we're leaving to our children? You know, how can we better manage the resources that we have? And they realized that this is not the way that we've been handling things is not an appropriate way. And 21% of them talked about, as Larry just pointed out, the weird, warm, and wild weather that we've been experiencing. And many people connect that to the changes in the Arctic. It's something that actually in the scientific community, we're still doing research on this because there's a lot of variation in weather, and it's kind of hard to say